Welcome to a Change Pick and Mix Learning Bump, brought to you by Dr. Jen Fram from Conversations of Change and Lena Ross from Change Hacks. You can watch these 10 to 15 minute clips delivered by either Jen or Lena anytime, anywhere, again and again. Now sit back and enjoy being bumped.
Hello, welcome to the Learning Bump on Change Communication. I'm Dr. Jen Fram and I'm really happy to be here with you today to help you with a little bit of change capability uplift. The topic of change communication is really close to my heart. This was the topic that I did my PhD on back in the early 2000s. And you don't have to go far to find many people who will tell you one of the most challenging things about implementing change is change communication. I'm going to give you some material in this learning bump which hopefully helps you a little bit more with that and reduces some of the challenges of change communication. So that we are clear with what it's about, here's how we're defining it today. Change communication refers to a range of communicative activities that are performed in order to facilitate successful change. Now, why is it important? Poor communication of change is repeatedly cited as a core driver of change cynicism, apathy, anxiety, and uncertainty-based stress. When a change communication vacuum occurs, it's inevitably filled with rumour, gossip, and misinformation. It's human nature to fill in the gaps. What we do know is that companies that are highly effective at both communication and change management are 3.5 times as likely to financially outperform their peers as companies that are not highly effective in either area. So what's the norm? For many managers, change communication means fact sheets, FAQs, roadshows, manager talking points. Good change communication means timely information that is fed to the troops, providing a consistent message and clarity in meaning. And if that's the worst that we get of change communication, then we're probably not doing so badly. And this is representative of our earlier thinking on change communication, which can still dominate today. In the early days, we defined communication as who says what to who, how, with what effect. And it implies a fairly simple linear process. But often, as leaders of change, we find change communication really challenging. It's not so linear and simple. It does become a little bit easier to think about when we recognise that there are three functions to good change communication. 1. Change communication serves the function of creating stability through providing information from credible sources. 2. Change communication serves the function of creating further change by creating conditions for dialogue and discussion. And 3. Change communication serves the function of making sense of change. Now, to be effective at change communication, we have to move from thinking about communicating the change to communicating during the change. In that sense, change communication is more than just a tool to introduce the new structure, the new values, or the new culture. Change communication in our organisations becomes a vehicle with which we create new organisations. James Hume says that the art of communication is the language of leadership. And what this is really saying is that you as leaders set the tone of communication. And the more you get clear on what function do you want your communication to serve, the better your outcomes. Some of the people who have been very prominent in advancing the field are TJ Larkin and Sandra Larkin. Out of much research, they came up with the following principles. And as someone who has worked in this field for over 20 years, they couldn't be more spot on. They argue that we need to start having small conversations at the beginning of change. Don't wait to broadcast information once you're ready to go live. So start right at the beginning of your initiative. They also say that it's key to communicate face-to-face. Where you can, keep it personable and relatable. And thirdly, make sure that you're communicating the probable outcomes. We want to make it relevant to your people. Another very strong voice in the field is Carolyn Keeley of Canadian consulting firm Ingenium Communications. And from her best practices in change communication white paper, she says the content of communication on change communication should focus more on the emotional side of change rather than the rational. She also argues that great change communication is emergent and responsive rather than planned. And finally, good change communication needs to be in the domain of leaders, not internal communication teams. As a result of this wisdom, now we are more interested in what is the objective of our communication in context of change. So, do we want to inform? Do we want to educate, motivate, engage, calm people, enable, and evaluate? The more we get clear on what our objectives are of our change communication, the easier it is to do. So the answers to these questions determines which of the three functions we focus on: to create change, to create stability, and to act as sense maker. The simplest answer to these questions often comes from the age-old dialectic of change and stability. So what do you want to do? As a leader of change, do you want to create more change in your organisation with your communicative efforts? Or do you want communication to create some stability amongst the work you're doing? So for example, we talked before about what the default is, the use of fact sheets, FAQs, roadshows, and manager talking points. We don't want to throw these out because these in essence create stability. In a time of uncertainty, these tools provide some information that can reassure, educate, and clarify. Managers seek to stabilise the organisation by communicating the vision and educating employees of the benefits of the intended change. So these are reflected in speech acts or written directives that suggest a one-way direction, right? It's from you to your employees. This unilateral trajectory assumes a high degree of planned change and that the manager or the change communicator can control the message. However, these are not the communication tools that assist you in creating further change. For this purpose, you have employee forums, Web 2.0 enterprise systems, and a communicative culture that values listening and eschews hierarchical structures. Now, from the research perspective, researchers in the Management Communication Quarterly, authors Bucano and Gant, suggest that dialogic communication is distinctly different to the styles of communication you are most used to. So it represents an ability to engage with genuine care and respect, to generate reflective discussion and speak authentically, and it's often seen to have positive impacts on innovation and organisational change. But of course, this often requires managers to behave in a very different way communicatively. So the dialogic approach, of course, assumes that managers and employees possess the requisite competence to carry the dialogue. If this is somewhat of a different way of expressing yourself, you're actually going to have to work on how do you build these dialogic competencies. So it goes beyond strong interpersonal communication skills. It means that you need to have high emotional intelligence and you need to be able to suppress status and ego. You need to be able to listen, to be empathetic, and aware of the differences in order to adopt communicative practices that further change. You need to be able to listen, to be empathetic, and aware of the differences in order to adopt communicative practices that create further change. Now, one of the questions I often get asked is, can you communicate too much? I would argue that you can. And in some sense, it's a little bit of a Goldilocks situation in terms of communicating just right for your audience. So there's actually ample warning in the change management literature of the potential disaster that is under-communicating. So Rosabeth Cantor, John Cotter, both note the criticality of communication to the success of organisational change. Now, as we've already talked about at the beginning of this learning burst, poor communication of change is repeatedly cited as a core driver of change cynicism, apathy, anxiety, and uncertainty-based stress. Now, as we've already talked about at the beginning of this learning bump, Poor communication of change is repeatedly cited as a core driver of change cynicism, apathy, anxiety, uncertainty-based stress. We're going to get rumours and gossip if we're not doing enough work from a change communication perspective. But we hear little of the perils of over-communicating. While many say that you can't over-communicate during change, I argue that you can. Over-communication can also create anxiety, frustration, and cynicism. So we see negative effects of over-communication when management push a line out that doesn't resonate with the employees and is received as spin. Perhaps the project teams have neglected the awareness and understanding phase of change and have just jumped straight to trying to sell the messages to gain commitment. The timing of communication might be misaligned with the tempo of change. So they might be implementing bi-weekly huddles without actually thinking about, do they have that much to say? Or perhaps they're using channels that are not preferred channels of the employees. So using 10 daily emails when you could actually have one really substantial conversation. There's also a peril of when the source of change communication is not well respected. There's a sense of, so that person's talking again, we shut off. There can be so many competing messages about various change projects that they blur into one great big transformational white noise. So, how do you manage the Goldilocks version of change communication, where there's not too much, not too little, and just the right kind? Some of the things to look out for are a change communication strategy that is developed after research has been conducted on the change audiences. So really looking at your audience's preferences to understand what they want in terms of who the source of communication is, what the frequency, what channels, what jargon, what language you should use. Also, understanding the communicative climate of the organisation. So what is acceptable and what is taboo? Making sure that you have an understanding of the balance between your communication for stability, your communication for change, and your sense making. Creating a communications plan tailored to the different stages of change commitment. Making sure that your change communication plan has been reviewed and approved by the people you want to communicate to, so your audience, not just your project team and managers. And then finally, a communication calendar which maps the various messaging from all the various initiatives and provides opportunity to cluster the messages for simplicity's sake. So, probably wondering at this point, how are you going to apply this knowledge? So, I think the easiest way is just to prepare yourself with a change communication checklist and ask yourself, what information do my people need at what time? What are the communication preferences of my people? What are the topics that need to be clarified? So where's our opportunity for sense making in the change? And where and when would further dialogue and creation of new ideas be useful? This type of short checklist is most effective for reviewing what you're doing. So this brings us, of course, to your homework. And for this, I want it to be very simple. I just want you to take some time to reflect. Think about your change communication skills at the moment. Think about the objectives of what you're trying to do in your change. And reflect on, what could you be doing differently tomorrow? Do you need to do some more work on creating opportunities for further change? Do you need to provide more information in a way that your audience will listen to create stability? This has been a learning bump on change communication. If you've got any further questions out of this, do feel free to contact either Lena or myself. We're happy to assist.
You can watch these 10 to 15 minute clips delivered by either Jen or Lena anytime, anywhere, again and again.